50 years ago, Ontario Premier John Robarts saw in Canada's centennial an opportunity. He convened a landmark gathering of premiers from across the country for the aptly named Confederation of Tomorrow conference. As he explained in his opening remarks, it was an occasion to, quote, take the mood of our people, to review our successes, to discuss our failures, and to plan for our future. A half-century later, and coinciding with the Confederation of Tomorrow 2.0 conference, put together by the Mowat Centre, we're taking up some of those challenges afresh. And to do that, we welcome Leslie Whitehigh, former chief of the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation; Martha Hall-Findlay, president, CEO, Canada West Foundation; John Boyko, historian and author of Sir John's Echo, The Voice for a Stronger Canada; Jen Wallner, professor of political science and public policy at the University of Ottawa; and Félix Mathieu, PhD student in political science at Université du Québec à Montréal. Bienvenue, Félix. Enchanté. It's a pleasure to have you here. To the rest of our guests, lovely to see you here as well. Let us do today what John Robarts suggested we do 50 years ago, and just start by taking the temperature of our country. Martha Hall-Findlay, how strong is our federation today?
Well, the Federation is strong, but I think there's some real challenges with the people in it in terms of our attitudes.
Meaning what?
Meaning, I really feel there's so many examples of this now, and over the last few years that a lot of us are forgetting about being Canadian. A lot of us are actually forgetting that we are, in fact, a whole country. So right now we have provinces either suing or threatening to sue the federal government. We have the federal government challenged by municipalities. We have municipalities fighting against the federal government. We have Indigenous communities that are pro-development now having real challenges with Indigenous communities that are anti-development. And that's something that's also very, I think, new in terms of the current history. We have, for goodness sake, we have people in Alberta and Saskatchewan now fighting over whether contractors on construction sites have their respective license plates. There's very, very much a growing sense, I sense and I fear, that it is way more, what is in whatever for me, for my region, for my municipality, for my community. And I really do worry that we're forgetting about what we need to do in Canada. I've been saying this the last number of while. We need a whole lot more Canadians. We need to put our Canada pants back on.
Put our Canada pants back on. I bet that's something that's very much evocative of Sir John's Echo. What do you think, John?
I agree absolutely with everything that you've just said, and I think we need to look at what is happening in the United States. There are 2 times in American history where the United States was threatened with basically tearing itself to pieces, and the first was in the Civil War when it literally was being torn to pieces and 700,000 people died. And I think the second time in which they're threatening to tear themselves apart is right now. There's a reduction to tribalism in the United States that I believe that Trump is a symptom of. He wasn't the cause of it. And the greatest fear that I have for Canada, and it's what you've just said, is that we follow that lead and we are reduced into tribalism ourselves. Whichever tribe that we choose to call ourselves Quebecers or Westerners or whatever we choose to say, that we belong to this group and we no longer see the national as the most important part of what we are as a people. I think we need to bring that back into our national conversation as a national conversation. There's a number of ways to do that, and I think this conference is a terrific contribution to that conversation.
Jen Wallner, what say you?
I have to say, I respectfully disagree. I think that part of being Canadian, which is a complete construct anyways, and not everybody feels Canadian, and that doesn't necessarily have a definition to it, but part of this country has in fact been people contesting one another and pushing each other to try and find their place and find their space, and through that contestation, that's how we've actually advanced. We also, unlike the United States, have stronger political institutions that help to prevent against kind of falling back into total tribalism or the same type of fragmentation and the discord that we're seeing there. It's not that I think that everything is rosy here in Canada either by any stretch of the imagination, but I, for one, am quite positive about the way that things can move forward.
Félix, 50 years ago, there were bombs blowing up in mailboxes in Quebec, which is one of the reasons why Premier Robarts wanted everybody, all the premiers, to get together and talk about what does Quebec want.
Yeah.
Are we clearer on that today?
Well, depends. What does Quebec want? Some people would just say more, but it depends also on what is more. But on this question, I would agree with Jen. I would like to state clearly that I think it's fully legitimate for citizens in Canada that to have to possess multiple and nested identities. And Canada being a multinational state, it is important to understand that there are multiple national constituent partners that need to come together and to discuss about what is the common good in Canada, and that there is no single partner in Canada, in a federation, that shall rule them all. And that, I think that is what's all about in federalism.
Leslie, I've purposely left you for the end because 50 years ago, Indigenous relations were not on the agenda of the Confederation of Tomorrow conference at all. Would you agree that today Indigenous issues are very much more front and center in the country?
Sure. I believe that is one of the positive changes that are occurring. I certainly, as the former chief of Chippewas of the Thames, felt it immediately in terms of our relationships, not only with the federal government, but the provincial government and the municipal government. But I would disagree. I think that what Canada has built itself on is the fact that it has differences in approaches, differences in perspectives. But what's missing is obviously the First Nation perspective, and it was missing 50 years ago. I wouldn't say it's there yet. I'm questioning what you mean by tribalism. I'm a little bit worried about what you describe as tribalism. I like to describe them as evolving political communities, and I think that something like the Confederation for Tomorrow is going to open up a really robust conversation that's going to let us just explain to each other our definition and terminology, and what we see will benefit Canada and the people inside of it, because I think there's got to be a recognition that First Nations don't often, and many don't, refer to them as citizens of Canada. And that's a real issue in terms of federalism.
I think it's not a bad thing that we clarify what John meant by tribalism, because the word obviously has numerous connotations.
It sure does.
What do you think, John?
The groups are defined in a number of different ways, and you were referring to it as an ethnic, it's a class, it's a number of different ways that you identify yourself, you self-identify with this particular group, and the groups are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, and as that happens, then the unifying construct vanishes. And without that, then there is a chance of the shards vanishing and the unity disappearing. I agree totally that our strength is our diversity. It's not a weakness to have a diverse country, it's a strength. And that, I think, is what the Americans are killing themselves with right now, trying to come to grips with that concept. I hope that Canadians can agree on that we are not looking for one monolithic, this is a Canadian. That's anti-Canadian thought. What we have to do is find the strength in our diversity.
And I agree with Jen. Part of it is that we have had these battles for a long time. My sense, however, is that we've gone past that, and in two ways. One, over many years, the federal government would use its declaratory power to say, no, this is actually a federal undertaking, and so therefore we actually need to have these rules apply. It's been a long time since we've seen that. So at one point, the different identities that we have are absolutely what makes us such an incredibly strong country. But they're not mutually exclusive. We also, I think, need to step back and say, but what also makes us a country? Whether it's trying to build infrastructure, which we haven't been able to do for years now, whether it's trying to get goods to go from one province to another. Hope the Supreme Court justices are listening. The Como beer case.
Like beer, for example.
Yeah. We want, but it's a question of national leadership, but national leadership being shown not just by federal politicians, but national leadership shown by provincial leaders, national leadership shown by the business community, national leadership shown by all of the people engaged in all of the conversations that we're having, because that, I do worry. I think we're missing that. We're also Canadian.
We're going to show, forgive me, former chief, but I want to bring up the first of several graphics here which indicate how people in this country think about one another. And these are all done by the Mowat Centre, which is the public policy think tank for the province of Ontario. Which province has the most influence on important national decisions? And you see how Ontarians view that question. They think, yes, they do, but just barely. Whereas Quebecers, Felix, think Ontarians really have it over Quebecers when it comes to national decision-making influence. We certainly don't feel that way in the province of Ontario, but you do in Quebec. How come?
Well, I think there are multiple perceptions that may explain this type of data, but the main thing here I would say is that Quebecers feeling that they are not properly or formally recognized as a minority nations evolving within Canada, that may be something really important for them, that when they come to understand how the politics work at the federal government, they see they just don't recognize properly our distinctiveness. And I would say, just as it is the case for Indigenous nations, I would say it's worse for Indigenous nations throughout the Canadian history. And on this point, it's fundamental to feel that you're properly recognized in your distinctiveness, to feel that you belong to this polity. And this feeling of belonging, I would say, because there are multiple ways of belonging to the Canadian polity, and multiple identities are not a zero-sum-up game.
So, if in 1981, Quebec had signed on to the Constitution, or if in 1990 with Meech Lake, Quebec had signed on, or in 92 with Charlottetown, things would be better?
I would think so. I don't think that the 1981 or 1982 deal was a deal that was fair toward Quebec nor towards the Indigenous peoples, but I would say that the Meech Lake was pretty fair towards Quebec, and the Charlottetown Accord was building on something really fair towards the Indigenous peoples with this idea of another order of government for Indigenous peoples. And I think this is an institution that makes it possible for multiple national constituent members in a polity as Canada to really emancipate themselves within Canada.
Jen, conversely, if we look at how Ontario's relative power has either increased or decreased since Confederation, what do you see in terms of the province's heft in national conversations now?
I think that to my mind, there has been some decline, relatively speaking, in Ontario's influence. But that's, I would argue, is a good thing, and that's reflective of power shifts within the country and the rise of natural resource revenues and other provinces kind of taking a firmer place in Confederation or in the Federation. But that being said, I think that in recent years, Premier Wynne, for instance, and Premier Couillard's initiative to have joint cabinet meetings, it's a small thing, it's a symbolic thing, it's a gesture, but it's the start of a different model of decision making. That I think within that kind of change of apparatus, we could actually see Canada's premiers, and territorial and provincial, take a more prominent place in guiding the direction of the country.
They're not, for the record, the first ones to have done that either.
No.
Robarts did it too.
Yes, that's
50
true.
years ago.
Yeah.
He was a little ahead of the curve in a lot of things.
He was ahead of the curve.
How about you? The relative power that Ontario and or Quebec hold in the country today in terms of resolving the issues that you care about?
For us, it's a good thing with this Liberal government because they're...
Which Liberal government?
The Wynne government.
Okay.
Because they've been very proactive in terms of recognizing a need to build a relationship with First Nations in Ontario. So it's a good thing if we feel that Ontario is seen as leading the way, because we need them to, we need a champion. We need somebody who can show a new way in terms of truth and reconciliation. Is it the best way? No, there's definitely some things that need to be worked on, but at least there's a, I feel and I felt for the past 2 years that we were at the table and people were listening and they were staying long enough to pay attention to the context with which we were trying to describe our nationhood, our polity, our nations within a regional body politic. And they're not groups, and we don't define ourselves as groups, and that's a context that needs stating over and over and over again. We don't consider ourselves special interests, and we don't consider ourselves a minority group. We see ourselves, as Felix had mentioned earlier, that it's a third pillar of government.
You are
really
more fundamental than that.
Yes, absolutely. The treaties were signed with the Crown, which was the British at the time, for our communities in the southwestern Ontario. This federalism is something that was, delegated to a Canadian new government of leadership that kind of placed it over top of us. We never really thought it was something to recognize to begin with.
Well, let's look at the next. Let's look at this next set of graphics then. What level of government should take charge of important issues? And again, Ontarians and Quebecers think very differently about these things. In Quebec, they overwhelmingly think that the provincial government ought to take the lead or have things stay pretty much as they are. You see a very small role for the federal government in the province of Quebec. And Ontarians, boy, we're such a get-along to go-along lot, aren't we? The largest number, let's just keep things the way they are. And with the federal government coming second and the provincial government coming third. Okay, Martha Hall, what do we do with this? When we have such fundamentally different ways of looking at how the respective regions of the country are expected to solve problems, how do we solve problems?
So can I just point out that you only actually have talked about Ontario and Quebec?
Well,
and yet we're talking about national decisions and regional views. That's part of the problem.
Well, okay, I hear what you're saying because you're from Western Canada, so I get it.
Throw that. Yeah.
These are all numbers that the Mowat Centre has done as a survey meant to compare
Ontario and Quebec specifically, and I get that. But I'm just.
But you'll use it as an opportunity
partly because, you know, this conference had happened 50 years ago. Just before we came on air, I said, well, and the Canada West Foundation was formed not long after that conference because there continued a real sense of frustration that decisions were being made by Ottawa in central Canada that affected the whole country, but weren't actually taking into consideration the views and perspectives of some of the issues facing the different regions. But it's almost going back to Ontario and Quebec, because that's not in the focus. It's been never thus, hasn't it? I mean, it's probably not surprising that the numbers are the way they are, because I think that's reflective of attitudes for decades now, isn't it?
In your view, Felix, if more power is centralized with the national government, tell us about the experience around the world in terms of how, either strong or not, separatist movements can become.
Yeah, to answer first to the first question about the data here, I think that the dissolution is asymmetrical institutional arrangements, because if we can have those asymmetrical arrangements, it makes it possible for, say, Quebecers to have a given deal, to have the institutions that makes it possible to preserve what makes it distinct in the first place, and then to have other provinces to have other deals. And usually this argument is mobilized to say that if we have asymmetrical institutional arrangement, it will break up the country. Now, if we go beyond Canada, if we look to experiences like that of Spain or the UK in the previous years, we see that it is not because of asymmetrical institutional arrangement that those countries, the debates about breaking out the countries is emerging. Rather, it's because of a lack of autonomy through self-governance for those minority nations. So I would say maybe asymmetrical institutional arrangements is the glue that makes it possible to hold together such a complex society.
So basically what you want to do is reject the vision of Canada that the current Prime Minister's father espoused.
Exactly. That's basically, to put it in one word, I would say we must reject Trudeau's vision. I think we should build on John Roberts' vision, which is all about duality and regionalism. I think we should go from duality to multinationality, but then this idea, I think John Roberts' vision, I think it's a pretty good idea.
Okay, let me ask about another John, Sir John A. Macdonald. How would he have felt about that duality?
Sir John A. Macdonald was looking at things in the mid-1800s, and what he was looking at the time, and all of the other founders, not just Sir John, was the British example, which he then brought to Canada with respect to parliamentary democracy and the monarchy. And he was looking at the American example, which he brought to Canada, he and the others brought to Canada with respect to a written constitution. But what they were looking at was the failure of the American system, the failure that was being fought on the battlefields at the time. The founders believed that the Americans had got it wrong in that they had put too much power in the state governments, in the subnational governments, and not enough power in the federal government. So therefore, they were going to fix that mistake, turn it on its head, and that was the vision of the country that was put forth by just about every Canadian Prime Minister since. I would argue that Mr. Harper is an exception to that, but every Canadian Prime Minister since then has forwarded that vision. That vision has become more complex. I think that there has been a realization among a number of federal politicians, not just prime ministers, the asymmetrical federalism that you're referring to is essential. It's essential from the people of Quebec. It's essential if we are ever going to solve the issues revolving around Indigenous nations. I think it's essential if we're going to reach a consensus on some of the things that need to happen to bring other regions into the country.
Western alienation
exactly.
is not there's a thing there.
Exactly.
And
It's still a thing.
But it is. I think it's even more a thing now over the last few years. But I wouldn't discount this at all. I think it's a really interesting concept to. How do we make us more unified by not necessarily insisting on being so unified? It's not. It didn't say it nearly as articulately as you did.
But you mean we don't have to treat every province exactly the same way in order to feel more unified?
Or
region. Right.
Yes, I think it's an interesting discussion, absolutely, to have.
I agree, and that is part of the complexity that I think makes Canada the Canada that we love, and that is the complexity that we need to celebrate, not try to tamp down.
Jen Waldner, I'll get you to, forgive me, you go ahead.
There's a model already in Canada that you can look to. First Nations are looking inward, looking at their history from their perspective, with all due respect to the historians in the room, but those histories are archived in different ways and interpreted different ways by First Nation historians that need to be told in a different way. And we're going inward because we need to rethink about our nationhood in terms of how we work with one another as nations in Ontario, across the nation. And we're doing the opposite. We're actually going into the community, understanding our particular history related to treaty and how that reserve came to be and what that relationship with those settler communities around us were. So then we can come together as broader kind of almost treaty partners, although that's a colonial construction too, where we also have to now, I believe that we have to, as nations within Canada that are Indigenous, we need to then re-put together our confederacies. I wouldn't say they were completely lost, but we've got a lot of decolonization to do, and going inward, going regional, going very local is the way we need to start. We need to start at home.
Can I understand that? When you say re-putting together your confederacies, this is a job within the Indigenous communities of the country that has to be done.
It has to be, and so we're looking for a model where we want to build this kind of a spirit of collectiveness. For First Nations, we're doing that first in our own local communities, and we're celebrating those histories. But our confederacies are really what's going to make us stronger and really build this really dynamic place called Canada, if those can be recognized as they are in the Constitution right now.
Just because I enjoy ticking off Martha Hull Finley so much, we're going to show some more numbers that only compare Ontario and Quebec. But Felix is okay with this. Those who feel very attached to Canada. Ontarians overwhelmingly feel very attached to Canada, and Quebecers do not. At least not in the way that we do. Let's add that. And how about those who feel very attached to their province? Ontarians, not so much. These numbers from the Mowat Centre, surveying the people of Ontario, the people of Quebec. Ontarians still very much see themselves first and foremost as Canadians, with a secondary attachment to their home province. Quebecers, quite the contrary. It has been thus for, well, I guess only 150 years. But let's try this. Felix, when the Confederation of Tomorrow conference was held 50 years ago, Quebec was in the midst of its quiet revolution. It has since had 2 referendums on sovereignty. What do you think the state of the sovereigntist movement is today?
Well, I think it's pretty low compared to what it became in the 70s, in the 80s, and then in the 90s. But I would argue that it is possible that it gets higher, that the support for independence gets higher in the foreseeable future.
What would do that?
I think, for example, a clear political act that rejects the possibility to recognize formally within the Constitution Quebec as a nation. I think that because in 2006 we recognized at the National Assembly, not the National Assembly, but at the House of Commons in Ottawa, that Quebec is a minority nation, is a nation within Canada.
The Québécois.
The Québécois. The Québécois, not the Quebecers. I would say
not the province,
not
the people.
I would say that it is fundamental that we correct this mistake, because the motion should have been about the Quebecers, not the Québécois. And on this point, I say if we reject totally the possibility to recognize the Quebecers collectively as being a nation, a distinct nation within Canada, this may fuel again Quebec separatists. But I don't necessarily vouch for this. I think we should really embrace multinational conception of federalism and democracy.
Let me go to Jen on this then. Is this why so many politicians in the country for the last, well, I guess 20 years basically, since the last referendum in 1995, 20 plus years, have been afraid to dip their toe back into these constitutional waters, because if it fails, we're back to a separation crisis again.
Yeah, it's a bit of winner-take-all politics when you engage in referenda and when you try and engage in constitutional bargaining. And there's also this notion, and this false notion that Felix also pointed out, that it's a win-lose, right? Binary kind of, somehow if one identity becomes stronger than others, then that's it for all the other identities, and it's all in or nothing. But also, just to return a little bit also to the previous question, one of the key problems that we have is it's politically expedient to capitalize on regionalism. So Jason Kenney, I'm sorry, but right now what he's doing in Alberta is, I find a bit troublesome.
Tell me what you mean specifically.
Specifically about equalization, and specifically trying to whipsaw up a notion, an erroneous notion that equalization is a province-to-province transfer, which it is not. Equalization is from federal tax revenues. It's wealthy Canadians across the country paying into federal tax dollars that then get redistributed across the provinces and then also up to the territories.
Well, and corporate taxes, not just wealthy Canadians.
That's true, yes.
A lot of corporate taxation goes
it's federal tax dollars, right? And this is a very important, crucial point that I think is one of the reasons why we can start to further solidarity in the country. And then once we actually start really embracing and building Indigenous peoples into that fiscal relationship with better fiscal stability, this will also further the country as a whole. And so the challenge that we face often is that it is very politically expedient. Ontario, in fact, engaged in those types of politics itself years ago when it was asking for its fair share of equalization. And it's an easy argument. You know, the more complicated argument is, okay, well, this is really why this money is moving from here to here. So this is where I see a bit of a challenge.
That's a little bit of that we're, you know, let's put our Canada pants on. Equalization was actually a recognition that we're all in this together, which I think was philosophically a wonderful thing. Can it be tweaked? Can we fix it? Can we deal with certain things? Yes, but listen, there are a lot of people who are very concerned with any provincial or any politician, period, going down that path, because it is dangerous on a bunch of levels, but it also loses that thread that you can be Albertan and Canadian, you can be Quebec, well, that might be a little harder, but...
but can you speak to her point that she feels Jason Kenney, the new leader of the Unified Conservative Party, is essentially ginning up this issue for partisan political gain to the detriment of the country as a whole?
There are a number of things that get said, and it's not just Jason, it's a number of people in different provinces. Premier Brad Wall has had some challenges with the federal carbon tax proposal. This is where you need to have people who, this is the national leadership that I'd like to see, provincial politicians, among others, showing more. Manitoba came to the table, had huge problems with the federal carbon tax, but has come to the table with its own made in Manitoba solution. Let's at least figure how we can work this stuff out. That's the kind of leadership that I like, that I think we should see more of, because I agree completely. We see more of this, it becomes more regional and more antagonistic.
Actually, sorry, I'm just going to jump in and follow up with this, maybe instead of Canada pants, can we put on our pan-Canadian pants? Right? And
I'm not sure what that looks like.
I say that, well, I don't know, frying pan, I don't know.
It's like, it's not pretty.
But the reason why I say this, actually, and all joking aside, there has been a big shift, actually, in the way that the federal government presents programs that used to be called national. In the media, it's still called national, but it's the Pan-Canadian approach to climate change, or Pan-Canadian framework to climate change. And there's a reason why they do that, and it's so that it recognizes and acknowledges that provinces and territories have jurisdiction over the environment and over climate change policy, and that they have their own expertise, and that they can figure out which way exactly they're going to meet their targets. And I think that's actually important, because that actually pushes us further down this line of informal asymmetry that can build our diversity in together. It frees up the necessary space to bring Indigenous peoples into the conversation as well. And again, that's why, Pan-Canadian. Let's
okay.
Go for it.
Follow my tortured.
Find the logo for that.
Follow my tortured logic here for a second, if you would, and then we'll get into some discussion, because I very much want to follow up on what you just had to say a few moments ago, Felix. 1967, 50 years ago right now, the Confederation of Tomorrow conference is happening. The premiers of 9 of the 10 provinces, not British Columbia, are all together discussing the future of the country, and in particular, the Quebec question. 4 years later, we did get unanimity on a constitutional repatriation agreement. They met in Victoria, BC, and it did happen. And then when Robert Bourassa, the very young, I think 36, 37-year-old Premier of Quebec, came home, he felt he couldn't sell it, and the deal fell apart. 10 years later, we got the deal that we have today, repatriated Constitution, Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Everybody signed on, Bill Davis, Pierre Trudeau driving the bus, and I guess I should say Pierre Trudeau and Bill Davis driving the bus, technically. But no Quebec signature again because the separatist government was in place. Meech failed, Charlottetown failed. Okay, look at the cast of characters we have today. We have Trudeau Jr., the original repatriator of the Constitution's son, a Francophone, in the Prime Minister's office. We have a liberal, very federalist Premier of Quebec. We have a liberal, progressive Premier in the province of Ontario. In your province, Alberta, and in British Columbia, 2 social democratic, certainly center-left governments in those provinces. The ducks are lined up in what might be an unprecedented way to re-enter these kinds of discussions to get Quebec's signature, enfin, on the Constitution. I see no interest whatsoever in having this happen. Do you regret that?
Well, I just wrote a book in which I present this opportunity, and I said it would be interesting of having new debates. I think younger generations may have new voices to add up to this debate. And 50 years ago, just sometimes before the Confederation of Tomorrow, Pierre Trudeau published a book, Federalism and French Canadians, in which he says Canada could become the envied seat of a form of federalism that belongs to tomorrow's world. And I would argue that, of course, that's a good idea, but Canada has since failed to become this envied seat of a form of federalism that belongs to tomorrow's world because it followed Trudeau's own vision. And if we go to the new policy on Quebec's affirmation and Canadian relations that the Quebec government recently adopted in late June, that's a fair attempt, I would say, to combine what the core elements that is shared rule and self-rule that really lie at the heart of federalism.
That is as federalist an outreach by any government in Quebec in 50 years.
Exactly.
It really is. And the response, John, from English Canada was a resounding thud. Nobody reached out when Quebec reached back. Other way around.
Cheered.
Nobody cheered. Exactly right.
Yeah, true.
Why? I mean, there's 2 schools of thought on this, I guess. One is that the country's sort of muddling along just fine, so why bother dipping your toe into that lake again? And the other is we have this irritating situation that has yet to be resolved, and we need to. Where are you?
The Supreme Court says it doesn't need to be resolved.
That's
so
true.
we have to keep that in mind too. The Supreme Court said that Quebec's signature on that document essentially does not matter because they are part of Canada and so that they're in.
But he just said it did matter.
I know. So what we're talking about is the symbolism that matters. And do we want to drag the country through the constitutional debates that just about tore the country apart, tore communities and families apart, again, to cure a symbolic issue? And I think
Felix does.
I think Felix does.
Yeah.
And I think most Canadians would say no. And I think there needs to be a little bit more time. Now, time, my God, when we start talking about a little bit more time. But these things take generations to create, and they take generations to heal. And I think we need a new generation farther removed from the tearing apart of the country that the last constitutional era had before we can do it again. I think there's a number of things that can be done in the meanwhile, and I think those things can be done, and I think there are being done. But I would agree with those to say, do we really want to risk the country in order to solve a symbolic problem?
Leslie, I want to ask you the question. If we were, for whatever reason, to dive back into that issue, to try to get Quebec's admittedly symbolic signature on our constitutional family framework, do you think that would be good or bad for Indigenous people?
It'll depend on Quebec's stance with their First Nations that share that territory with them. I think they've made it pretty clear that they wouldn't agree to something separate except their own autonomy in terms of how to approach that.
In other words, if Canada is divisible, so is Quebec.
Yes, absolutely. As is Ontario all the way along and all the treaty territories. And I would imagine all of the First Nations would support that, and you'd see a nationwide attempt to cause some tension, I'll put it mildly, with Quebec. if those things weren't taken care of prior to how you enter into this statehood. But the reality is that we won't. I don't know. I wish there was data on the sentiment of how Canadians feel about Indigenous self-determination.
I just happen to have
wow.
in my hot little hands.
Okay.
You ask, we have.
All right.
Okay, Sheldon, don't make me look bad here. We got this? Perfect. Have governments gone far enough to promote Indigenous reconciliation? And we have actually the strongest plurality in both provinces saying, no, we haven't gone far enough, and the public is prepared, it seems, to do more.
Wow, that's incredible. That's really good news.
How do you react to that?
I think that's, I don't know if it's something we need to rip a constitution open because we have Section 35, and because, to be quite honest, First Nations have those inherent rights and feel the Constitution is not that thing or that object or that tool that's going to derogate from that or any way take away from that. We just know it to be true. What I do think, though, is there is an opportunity here right now with Romeo Saganash's recent second reading of the UNDRIP integration into the Canadian legislative frameworks, that there is a next step process available to Canadians to start to really have a concerted strategic sit down on how this could happen. And we need that space. We need it in so many different ways and shapes and forms, and we need it in a way that's going to be respectful, show honor, show a peaceful want for collaboration on these things. But my fear also, there's fear in that as well. No doubt about it, we all agree United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is an incredibly powerful document across the globe. The trouble I'm worried about in talking about pan-Canadianism is that if that's adopted fully as the framework, it's going to not address Haudenosaunee law. It's not going to address the Anishinaabeg law. It's not going to address Cree law because it's gone so pan-Canadian, as we're so used to being identified as, that we have again lost our distinction at that very nation level. So there's got to be some carefulness in this.
Sure. Jen.
But this is actually where the value of federalism is really front and center, because the provinces and territories themselves are designing their own respective modes of either pursuing the adoption of UNDRIP, like BC has signaled its intention to follow through, and so has Ontario with flexibility. But some of the other provinces and territories are leaving it a little bit more open and instead using, say, for example, in Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq already have their own version of duty to consent that's well entrenched within the Nova Scotia political system. Northwest Territories, similar type of thing. You know, they made these moves in 2007, long before the federal government made recognition and moved in favor of this direction. And so, you know, that's where having strong provinces with effective public servants and political parties and robust political communities, again, that gives us the flexibility to kind of try and find these spaces and for you to be able to say, hey, wait, this model doesn't resonate here and we need to make adjustments.
What would you gauge the appetite of the NDP government in Alberta for reopening some of these questions so we could get the issue Felix cares about so much, and many others in the country, resolved?
This is not to be a negative reflection on the NDP government as such. It is because the answer is there's not a lot of appetite. I don't think it is out of any sense of a lack of pan-Canadian attitude at all. I think it really is more a sense of there is no shortage of stuff on Premier Notley's plate. We're now into an election cycle, and it's going to be, you know, I think, you know, Jen alluded to some of the rhetoric. It's going to be very tough. And so I actually think this is one of the reasons why there just is so little appetite. The last times we went through this, it just, you know, some of us are old enough to remember this, right? It just took all of the oxygen. It took all of the effort. And when you have other people saying, I really get that, but I have oil that I need to be able to export, I have jobs I need to worry about, I have people's livelihoods, I have a whole lot of, I have deficits I have to deal with. Like I have, you know, and this could be any politician, but when you have other really serious things on the table, it's hard to get them, especially now when you're into the election cycle. It's just, it's not out of a desire to accomplish something for the country. It really is more practical. This is going to be tough.
Canada is a process, and we muddle along. Yes. That is our time, everybody. I want to thank our guests, one and all, for coming from near and far, for joining us tonight here on TVO. That's Martha Hall Finley from the Canada West Foundation, and Félix Mathieu, Université du Québec à Montréal, on the right-hand side of the table. That's geographically, not necessarily politically. Jen Wallner, Professor of Political Science, Public Policy, University of Ottawa. John Boyko, we recommend his book, Sir John's Echo, The Voice for a Stronger Canada. Leslie White-Eye, former chief of the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. À la prochaine fois.
Thank you very much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.